Welcome to Commander Versus, where we take two commanders and compare them to each other and determine which is best. First, let's talk about Joan Prime. Joan Prime has solid AoE damage, which has great burst potential because of the recast on her 4th skill, allowing you to put out a bunch of damage, alongside the damage and rage boost that she provides on her active skill, and talent selection in the support tree that allows her to speed herself up and slow enemies down, helping her stick to low, fragile enemies. Next, for Nevsky, you have top tier single target damage, as well as a defense debuff, and an insane amount of skill damage you can get up to 60% off his 4th skill. Pair that with the health on his 2nd skill and the health on his expertise, and you have an extremely tanky commander that does a ton of single target damage. Now, only one commander can win, and the edge for this one for me goes to Nevsky, although Joan is a great support option that I also recommend you building. What pairing should I do next? Let me know in the comments. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode, we have Huo versus Joan. First, for Huo, you get great early burst damage between his actual skill damage factor and the fact that during the first sections of combat, he gets reduced rage cost and increased skill damage, as well as the fact that he also stacks skill damage in some of his other skills, making him great when you're popping in and out of the field of battle, and does great boost to your secondary commander as well, making him actually an ideal pairing for Joan Prime, alongside his skill tree and solid sustain on his expertise with the heal. Next, for Joan, as I've mentioned before, you get great AoE damage, good burst potential, and excellent support between the damage boost, rage boost, and then you have a speed buff and an enemy debuff to help stick to enemies. Overall, the edge goes to Huo just due to the sheer damage output, but I still say Joan is an excellent option that pairs well with Huo, as well as several other commanders, and is well worth the expertise. Welcome to Commander Versus. In this episode, we have a battle of the Cavalry Rally Meta Heavyweights, with Justinian facing off against Attila. First, Justinian has insane single target damage output, with a defense debuff that can stack very easily with Nevsky's since you automatically get the surrounded by 3, making him a nightmare for most garrisons. Pairing that with the defense and then the reduced normal attack damage taken, he makes a very solid, somewhat swarm resistant, but great damage output rally leader. Next, for Attila, is almost the opposite, foregoing all skill damage to maximize normal attack damage. Between that, his general tankiness, his resistance to skill damage debuffs because he doesn't deal skill damage, and top tier swarm resistance because of the sheer amount of white damage he puts out, and his immunity to silence, he's a punishing rally damage option to resist swarm and to beat enemies. But overall, the winner here goes to Justinian. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode, we have Liang versus YSG. First, with Liang, you have big damage on his primary with a great debuff, as well as the fact that he has solid tankiness and damage boosts on his other skills to help further punish enemies with that huge AoE and stay alive long enough to deal more of that AoE damage. Next, for YSG, you have the classic AoE that hits 5 targets, as well as the fact that you have an insane 50% skill damage. Not to also forget that the 2nd skill provides an insane 100% attack bonus and rage, which is both useful for dealing more skill damage, and makes any commander paired with YSG deal that much more damage between those two skills. Overall, the winner is still Liang. However, YSG does still make a great option, especially if you're looking to build 2 pairs of archers, or you're looking to build other commanders as well. Welcome to another episode of Pairing Versus, where we compare 2 commanders and decide which is best. In this episode, we have Joan Prime and William. So Joan Prime, as I mentioned in the first video, has good damage with her AoE that becomes great when you compare it with the recast on her 4th skill, as well as the fact that her damage and rage buff on her primary skill can be used multiple times to help yourself and allies. Pair that with the ability to speed herself up and slow her enemies in her talent tree with the support tree, and she is a nightmare for any fragile enemies and can pick off a lot of weak enemies that way. Next, for William, you have a great ally buff with defense and rage that you can use on yourself as well as the ability to block extra skill damage from buffs and deal a respectable amount of damage with this skill. On top of the fact that he has passive damage on his 3rd skill and great mobility on his 2nd, although he is a little bit fragile. Overall, the winner in this is Joan Prime, but both are great options. Welcome to another episode of Pairing Versus. In this episode, we have Boudica Prime versus Nebu. Boudica Prime is an excellent option with an insane debuff on her primary skill that increases skill damage taken by the enemy by 35% with a great single target damage vector as well. Add that to the fact that she has great resistances to swarm and debuff with the cleanse, and on her third skill's trigger ability to increase her normal attack damage. And it makes her ideal against heavy enemy swarms and field focus on any kind of archer troop. Next, for Nebu, you have great AoE damage, as well as straight up damage buffs that make secondary commanders deal that much more damage. While it's not on the level of YSG, it still has to be respected, and it has solid mobility to keep yourself alive for longer. Overall, I prefer Boudica Prime because she is just very tanky and it makes it great even if you are getting swarmed, it's forgiving. What commander should I do next? Let me know in the comments. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode, we have Scipio Prime versus Guan. First, for Scipio Prime, you have an insanely powerful debuff on an AoE that reduces health by 30%, which has to be respected. Great tankiness with damage reduction on his fourth skill, and overall a great health boost on his third, and basically makes him pairing is essential for most infantry commanders, and he pairs well with them. Next, for Guan, you similarly pair well with a lot of infantry commanders, where you have great mobility with your expertise leaving structures, and makes it great for staying in the field and moving around quickly. Sustainability and heal on his third skill, and great damage against both single target and groups of enemies due to his fourth skill. Overall, the win here for me goes to Scipio Prime just because he's so versatile. But let me know what you think in the comments. And which commander should I do next? Let me know down there as well. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode we have Zenobia squaring off against Flavius. First, Zenobia. Zenobia has a huge buff on her primary skill, which buffs health, and most importantly, normal attack damage, making her extremely painful to swarm and very resilient against many sources of damage since she has good damage resistances. On top of that, the normal attack damage buffs make her an ideal candidate to pair with Gorgo, sealing her viability in the current meta. Next, we have Flavius. Flavius is no slouch and puts out his damage primarily through his huge single target primary skill, as well as great counterattack bonus. Adds on stacking poison debuff that increases damage taken from infantry, and a silence on enemies when below 50% health due to the additional damage on his primary, and you have an incredibly solid but also damaging defense setup. But unfortunately, only one can win. Although it's tough, Zenobia gets the edge here due to the fact that she's a much better pairing for Gorgo. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode, we have Boudica Prime squaring off against Hermann Prime in a battle of the primes. First, Boudica. Boudica has a great single target damage on her primary with an instant debuff that hits a single target and is great normal attack damage bonuses to resist swarm, as well as a natural resistance to debuffs on her expertise, making her difficult to deal with and a great team contributor, both as a support debuffer and a damage dealer. Next, for Hermann, you get an AoE damage and debuff on the primary skill, which can stack to even greater heights over time, as well as a defense debuff on his third skill, making for a great level of debuff and a higher skill damage taken overall on multiple enemies, although at a significantly more fragile setup to do so. However, only one commander can be crowned, and although it's very close, Hermann does edge out Boudica here due to the impact of multiple target debuffs. However, I imagine Boudica will also be significant for quite some time. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode, we have a battle of the white damage garrisons, with Gorgo squaring off against Zenobia. First, we have Gorgo. Gorgo has insane damage output on her primary skill, with smite damage bonuses and increased normal attack damage dealt with her passives, making her great both 1v1 and against swarm. And since there are very few major counters to normal attack damage in the field rally meta, it leaves her more or less unimpeded to do a ton of damage and wreak havoc on anybody unfortunate enough to swarm her. Next, we have Zenobia. While Gorgo resists swarm by putting out a ton of damage, Zenobia does so by being insanely tanky and having a bunch of health and heals on top of significant damage reductions to make most damage pretty much ineffective against her. As with every episode of Commander Versus, there can only be one winner, and although Zenobia does fight valiantly, Gorgo gets the edge. But both of them together make an insane combination that I think everyone should at least try. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode, we have a battle of the infantry defenses, with Gorgo squaring off against Flavius. First, we have Gorgo, with insane damage output on her primary skill, passive bonuses to primary skill, normal, and counterattack damage, As well as a reduced skill damage taken buff and some health, you have a moderately tanky Garrison with a serious amount of damage output. Next, we have Flavius. Similarly, Flavius likes to resist Swarm through insane damage output, but instead with counterattack damage buffs, general damage buffs, and a stacking poison debuff, boosting infantry damage to the target, alongside some of the best Garrison talent tree availability in the game. The longer you fight Flavius, the more and more it will hurt. However, only one commander can come out on top, and in a close match we have Gorgo taking home the win. Although, like with Zenobia, the two of them can be combined for a devastating result on enemy rally.